A few more things connected with what seems to be ordinary mortal life and the heretofore unrecognized absolute literal biochemical basis. And a lot of you have written me notes and had your own observations regarding posing. Now, besides, as I tried to point out, some of the exaggerations that I did, I could take the extreme of models and magazines, which is an easy shot, but all the way into people looking thoughtful, to people looking prayerful, to people trying to look humble, to ordinary posture. You are still talking about, in all these cases, you're talking about an attempt to alter, to affect the biochemical condition of the person posing. But it does not have to be just something, as extreme as what I was making up of people getting into what would seem to be an easy observation of someone is really being affected. And it's not true. It's not limited to that. Because whatever you're doing, it is altering to some degree the biochemical makeup to wherever you were before. That if it is an automatic reaction from the way in which you're wired up, from your own biochemical condition, if we call it condition A, and we cut up reality into one spot, and there you stand, somebody of the opposite sex goes by, somebody of the same sex goes by, somebody in a Rolls Royce goes by, somebody in a pickup truck with a gun rack in the back goes by, and you shift. And it does not have to be by any means. If we tried to freeze reality and I jumped out of the bushes and said, all right, you're posing, we could be hard-pressed to say, well, that's any kind of pose, but you shifted. It may have just been throwing your hip one way. It could have been just your head dropped and you looked down. According to the kind of car and the kind of people went by, you may either turn around and look them dead in the eye with a certain degree of aggression, or for some reason, suddenly you got something in your eye and you looked away. All the way from a dump truck to a Rolls Royce. All of that is posing, and all of it is an attempt by that organism, that is, to wit you, to alter the biochemical condition. And I'm going to try and expand some of this, if I can drag your attention with me. You recall, does the yellow show up on camera? The three rings, the way in which I did it, are the three circuits. And what I want to try and point out to you tonight is an extension of that. I've talked around, I never gave you any terms, but many of you have had your own observation of how things must be connected. Recalling, of course, that it is not set up in the body in this manner. I could draw it, I could attempt through perspective and otherwise to draw it three-dimensionally. I could make the rings all interlocking instead of in a row like this. It is a fact that looked at from the horizontal view of the progression of life, that this diagram does fit, by me continuing to refer to this as lower circuits. The oldest circuits is the oldest one in you, it's the oldest one in every child that is born, and it is the oldest one in humanity. And then the progression does run, it just happens to fit a two-dimensional drawing. It runs somewhat in a manner for us to have to use up and down, forward and back, to try and show that things move. That this is not ill-founded for me to draw it that way. Just simply remember that's not the way it is. What I want to point out to you is each circuit you should think of as having three different levels to it. This would be the low level of red. Where red touches blue right here would be the mid level of red, and where red touches yellow, see right here, would be the upper. Without me drawing all over this, I assume that you can see that the blue right here, that would be the low level of blue. And where blue touches yellow would be its mid. Now, the reason I point this out is since none of the circuits, in the same way that nothing in existence of which you can conceive exists in some way isolated, in the same way the circuits are not isolated. Now, what I was going to try and draw your attention to is there is a way in which you can see something that I have never tried to point out specifically. in a way you can see, if you look and take the drawings I'm giving tonight, that the upper region of the blue circuit, in other words, if we were going to use ordinary terminology and talk about apparent human emotion, and say in the blue circuit or in the emotions, there are three different levels. One is getting, if it were possible, one is getting to the point, starting at that level, that would almost be, if it were possible, and it's not, but if it were possible, this would be almost pure emotion, whatever that would be, pure human emotion. And when you got up to the blue levels, mid part, which would be where it touches yellow, then you could say that it's watered down. You could say that it's partly emotion and it's partly thought. And then if there was such a thing in isolation, then here would be the upper level of emotion, and that would be something else. Then you would say, all right, there is emotion, if you could isolate it. There is human emotion turbocharged, pristine and turbocharged. But I want to direct your attention to the point at which the emotions, that circuit apparently comes in direct contact with the yellow circuit, with what appears to be thinking. And I want to point out to you that in that same sense, the upper blue is partially operative in most yellow circuit operations. I'm going to try and drag you toward this from several different ways. One is you could look at, for example, I'll make you up a new term, hyphenated, is the blue of hormones. Would, in a sense, decide what it is that the organism is going to think of. It decides what it feels is important enough to think of. And then the yellow circuit, its part in this kind of commingled operation would be to determine how it is thought of. Now, I would assume by now, and I've used extreme examples that would encourage such, that the way ordinary consciousness works, that it does have to isolate, it has to compare, and so if someone was trying to wrestle with, ponder about the activities of the yellow circuit, and the ways in which, if you recall, I had drawn out that description of the life factory of man, and the yellow circuit being up where it was research and development, the eggheads, while reminding you that everything was dependent upon everything below it and above it. But it would be quite easy for the ordinary yellow circuit itself to think of itself as being a domain wherein very abstract, almost totally abstract ideas were its fodder, such as mathematics. That how far removed would mathematics be, the hard sciences, how far would they be removed from crude, old, messy meatball emotions? But, by and large, what the yellow circuit is going to think of is commingled in its base by what the blue circuit feels is important enough to think of, which would include the example of mathematics. If I must drag your attention back to reality right quick, outside of my examples, remember I'm staying here talking as though people know what they're doing, are involved with this, that so-called consciousness is involved with determining this, which, give yourself a cold slap right quick and remember that we're not. I'm just talking about the way it appears to be and the way it manifests itself. So if you had someone that apparently, to use extreme examples again, was an out-and-out intellectual that never shows any sign of emotion, an absolute cold fish, and assuming that you had a blue circuit that was ordinarily wound up, and if it was ordinarily wound up, of course, its primary hobby is being pissed. And it's confronted with those, it passes those, or it reads about them, or sees them being interviewed that apparently are very intellectual, and the blue circuit in you wants to grab them. They're talking calmly about arms control, or about the problems of hunger in the world. And suddenly the blue circuit in you wants to grab the people, or the person involved, and accuse them of being a farce. That you have no feeling about this. You're talking from strictly some kind of clinical viewpoint. People like you would never help. You got to get excited. You should be crying over this. And you're staying there looking at notes and reading out statistics about how many people are starving to death in the next 30 seconds. Or somebody who apparently just has no feeling. Just the archetypical, intellectual, and yet, there is something in his circuitry, and the blue circuitry, that makes whatever subject he seems to be interested in, mathematics, physics, economics. There is something in his circuitry that feels, that's already wound up, that feels this is of importance. What I am trying to hint to you, as far as I can go without trying to allow myself to even tell you something, so don't say that I'm telling you anything. But that apparently the yellow circuit can believe that it can conjure up what it will concern itself with. That if I am sitting around and I begin to read about new research in particle physics, and I see reference to another book or some work going on, and I write it down so that I can find the book or look for it in the library, that is strictly, in some way, strictly a yellow circuit process. Because as I was sitting there, I didn't feel like, well, goddamn, they can't go into research like this. I didn't read about some new theoretical idea in mathematics, and I didn't, in no way did I look at it and go, gee, what a bummer, or my heart's broken, I'm mad. I got no feeling about it. It's intellectual curiosity, as though the yellow circuit, or any circuit, can suddenly pluck out of all the cornucopia of hobbies that I believe, just strictly out of intellectual, objective, scientific curiosity, I will go and read more about particle physics. I'll read more about what's being done in the post-game theories that's now being done in Yugoslavia. Down somewhere where the blue circuit and the yellow circuit are commingling. The blue circuit has a feel for what to it, to that wired up organism, of what is some importance. It feels as though this is important enough to think about. And it's not a linear situation, of course. It's not just that this happens in the blue circuit and it moves on the yellow circuit. But since words go in a line, here we go. That the yellow circuit has the feel that this is important enough for me to think about. And then simultaneously, in another direction, the yellow circuit then determines, based upon how it is wired up, of how it will think about what the, in a sense, blue circuit said, I got a feel for this. Let's think about it. It is as though, if you can begin to see it, that higher parts of the blue circuit are commingled in, at least the lower and the mid activities of the yellow circuit. I have no doubt that many of you will find this sticky. So let me try one or two more. If there was a conversely to this, if I could run it linearly backwards, but remember it didn't even run linearly the way I was speaking of it to begin with. But I could describe it going the other way, of then the yellow circuit having thoughts about what the blue circuit is sending up, feelings of this is important enough to think about. Then it thinks about not just the subject, but it thinks about the feeling that the blue circuit had. Well, one or two chuckles. After all I've pointed out, and after all the tasks I've given and things that you've seen on your own, haven't some of you wondered, who is it talking about the way I feel? Is it the blue circuit itself saying, well, here I go again, wanting to dress up like Premier Gorbachev's wife and pick up sailors, and simultaneously something's telling me, tut, tut, tut. Is it, in this case, I'll blame it on the blue circuit, the first part, is it one voice in you that simultaneously says, I'll go do so-and-so, and simultaneously, or linearly, if you're still conscious at that level, right after that, is it that same voice that says, oh no? You've had enough opportunity to find out, to observe for yourself, but even if right now you cannot recall, let me ask you a great rhetorical question, though. That seemed to be very efficient. At the widest that you can stretch your consideration of the many ways in which life works through man, would that be the most efficient? For all the tasks I've given of walking and trying to see these operations going on in certain ways, is it the same voice? I'll go ahead and answer that for you so that everybody won't sit there. You should know it by now. It's not always an astounding difference, but it is quite distinguishable that something has the urge that, hey, I'm going out, and I'm going to see if I can't pick up. I always want to do it. I want to get 4 women in bed tonight, or whatever your variation is. And almost simultaneously, even as you reach for the car keys, is this voice about why you can't, whatever the reason. Is it the same voice? It's not. So is it the blue circuit in this case, if we're to blame it on the blue circuit, just for instance? Is it the blue circuit saying, all right, I'll do so-and-so, and then simultaneously, or right afterwards, say, oh no, I can't. And then go right back to, oh yeah, I will. As it moves closer to the car, and it says, oh no, you can't. Well, you've got to find that out. All of you have had some glimpse of that by now. I didn't put these exact words on the description before, or what I was hinting for you to look for. It is not the same voice. But ordinarily people do not think about, just ordinary people, they do not think about the mind in some way being connected with the emotions. And they would not ever consider that the emotions in some way are at the base of what I think, assuming that they're the type that seem to be wired up to be thoughtful, to be partially yellow circuit centered, that they would seem to be the nemesis of one another. Thus it has been throughout the recorded history, throughout the life of the yellow circuit. It or somebody has been talking about, listen. It's been talking out there, and it's been talking in you. It says, look and listen. You should not get carried away with your feelings. You'd be much better off if you were more rational, if you were calmer. When things seem to be getting out of hand emotionally, you should be more like your Uncle Fred, the mathematician. It has been said internally by one's own voice and one's own partner's voice, and it has been said by life in various contexts. And conversely, there are those that normally comes out somewhere in the so-called arts. Those waving the flag for the arts, people say it now, people say it in the days of Greece, that listen, we're getting far too tied up in the mind. We're beginning to ignore the human spirit. We're beginning to ignore that which gives the joie de vivre to life, that which gives it some meaning. We can't have the whole world taken over by, and then they want to point out to them, archetypical intellectuals. We've got to have music. We've got to have art. We've got to have passion. We've got to have people who cry when they're hurt. We've got to have people who laugh deliriously when they're happy. That is a human life. We can't have people walking around that's nothing but huge brains with two little feet. So there you have what seems to be at least a 6,000-7,000-year-old battle going on, a debate. And it is going on in everybody at line level. But as long as you're operating primarily, as long as you're looking primarily at line level consciousness, that you're being fueled primarily by one of the circuits that seems to be speaking for you, seems to be speaking to you. As long as that's true, you cannot see that these two are distinctly connected. And that the yellow circuit does not simply pluck out of the clear blue sky by any means. I believe I will be an intellectual. I believe that I will sit down and read the dullest, most impassionate work on philosophy that I can find. The blue circuit was at the base of it. Of course, linearly, verbally, we have reached that great land again. But that can't be true. How is the blue circuit, if indeed that is somewhere close to emotions, as much as I've tried to hide it and confuse it, how can something that seems to be emotional then have a part in having another part of the organism say, well, what I'm going to do is find something to do that is absolutely devoid of emotion? That can't be, can it? Oh, yeah? Now, you're right, that couldn't be. Because then if we're going to split it up into other areas in artificial isolation, then the red circuit in favor of good behavior, let's say, it seems to be primarily in charge of just keeping the total physical being of the organism going, it would never do anything that would in the least way harm itself, would it? Hell no. Have you got a cigarette? Do you have a drink? May I have 4 more pizzas? 2 more weeks and I will have broken a record. I will have laid on this couch without moving for 6 months. Or conversely, I'll run some more. I only have shin splints in 3 of my legs now, and one of my ankles is still movable. Or, if you'll move to the other end, assuming there was one, that great brilliant yellow circuit, that great enthused, educated, and soothed intellect of man would never think of anything that would disturb itself, would it? The primary thing that I would like for you to try and remember from this general intro, if not outro, tonight, is that anything that you could apparently identify going on in the yellow circuit, which of course is not hard to do. If it's talking, it's using words, most of you got some feel for it now, that you would just simply say, well, that is, I mean, right now I'm focusing my attention. I can tell what's going on in the yellow circuit. Glimpses, frame by frame, catching a glimpse of it running around the corner. And yes, that's the yellow circuit. It's talking, but to see that whatever it talks about, another part of your organism had a feeling for it, or this part wouldn't be talking about it. And I don't care if it's talking about mathematics. I don't care if it's talking about being a scientist. It does not take analysis, it does not take Dr. Freud, for you to have your own realization, not based on any particular circumstance in your past, but to be able to feel it and to see it yourself, that there is a feel somewhere wired up into you that if nothing else, it's a feel of how it is for you to be thinking such thoughts. That I am not simply an overweight bricklayer or carpenter, not simply the totality of my bad moods. I subscribe to Omni, and I read it cover to cover. Science Today. I'm just, of course, drawing out a crude example that certainly wouldn't apply to anyone. crude possibility I was trying to point out is there is a feeling of how it is to be a person who faithfully reads each month issue of Signs Today. Based upon what you might be able to get from this tonight, or pursuing it on your own, is I would point this out. My intention, if I had one, was just to cover the overlapping of the blue and yellow. But you do see, do you not, that you got the red and the blue, and if you got real good, you can see the blue and the yellow turn back around. But that's very hard to see because none of you have ever hurt yourself while posing. I'm sure of that. None of you have ever tripped while thinking about something very important. And none of you, especially you people that are wired up to be very intellectual, none of you have ever had this thing turn in to apple jelly just because you had a cold. So it certainly does not close back upon itself, do it? But to stick with the yellow and the blue, here is something that you can do. If you find a way in which to do it, I can describe it fairly simply. We'll drag it right up to where you might see something. That is, attempt willfully to think about, to think what you feel. But in this sense, now listen, it's very simply the way I'm going to present it to you, is to think what you feel, is take what would be, if it existed like this, the extreme of where the upper region of the yellow circuit would be. It would be right at line level consciousness, the way I used to draw it on the nervous system. It's the yellow circuit operating in its purest form. It's never pure, but as pure as it could be. Back to the archetypical, apparently non-feeling, non-emotional, intellectual. It's try and turn a kind of absolute, precise mathematical analyzation on what you're feeling and determine, is this mathematically profitable? Is this even mathematically correct? Everything in the way in which I am wired up to feel. And I note that I keep feeling a certain way under apparent certain conditions. And they repeat themselves over and over. Forgetting about the past, forgetting that something caused it because nothing caused it. There is nothing to analyze in the psychological sense, but to simply become aware of that, and then try and turn the coldest, highest light of just ordinary, mechanical, yellow circuit activity on this, and question, is this mathematically defensible? I keep doing this, to what end? Attempt to turn yourself into the proverbial dispassionate intellectual that's looking on the way your emotional life seems to run, and don't discuss it. Don't attempt to get in conversation with the old partner about, well, wait a minute. Now, you know how I feel like this because you remember how your father used to drink and beat you up. That was just a bad dream. It's simply look upon what is occurring now in as cold and as clinical a way as possible, and find out where is the profit in this. And the closer you get, even just in at line level to the yellow circuit, it's not getting involved as to whether this is profitable in some kind of sense, like, is this profitable? When I feel like this, does this make me closer to being a real Christian, Jew, Buddhist, Mason, elk? It's none of that. It's not compared to anything. As you're trying to look at completely dispassionately, as I keep doing this, to what end? It would be as though, we'll go back to this, it would be as though that these things did operate in isolation or separate, And the yellow circuit looked at the blue circuit and said, all right, you keep feeling certain ways. Every time it rains, you get the blues. To what avail? What is this? Every time that your new boyfriend or girlfriend does not call within a 10-hour period, you begin to wring your hands. You begin to just immediately assume, all right, the jig is up again. Somebody loved me for a day or a night, but they immediately saw that I am just a worthless piece of garbage. You don't get involved in any discussion with this, the yellow circuit. If you get just at the upper level, you can't drag it into it. Not the way in which I'm describing it. I'm trying to take it, or taking it to almost cartoon terms, but this is the way in which it operates. As the yellow circuit was simple look, and it has no interest in why or compared to what. It is simple on the basis of re-expending energy. You seem to refuel yourself, and you obviously drag me into it. Of course, the yellow circuit, if it's operating the way I'm saying, wouldn't say that. I'm just saying you that. It would refuse, it would deny it, that happened. But it's on the basis as to what profit am I gaining from this? What possible end is being served? Would you please tell me that, Mr. Blue Circuit? Just, tell me. I don't care about the details. I don't care why it happened. You do it. I'm a scientist. I'm just taking what I have at hand. I see this repeated over and over. So if it's repeatable, it must be a scientific fact, and therefore it interests me. But you continue to do so-and-so, and then you continue to whine about it. Would you explain this to me? Would you give me an equation explaining this? And then to continue the cartoon terms, it is as though the blue circuit and everybody would say such things if it could happen this way. As well, look, I got this long story that you told me you don't want to hear about my terrible childhood. Some of it's so repressed I probably don't even know it. But I know it's there. And so now, I admit, sometimes it appears that I'm not working in my own best self-interest, perhaps, which is why I need analysis. That's why we need money, so I can afford analysis. But it's explainable. Certain situations, certain circumstances arise, and it seems to put pressure on me, and I operate in the only way I can. I cry. I drink. I go into moods of deep depression, sometimes for 24 hours. If things could operate in this kind of isolation, I'm suggesting to you, the upper parts of the yellow circuit would say, well, all right, I'm aware of that. It's good you can admit it, but would you tell me what is the apparent outcome accomplishing vis-a-vis what you say are the causative factors? How is your operation? How is your reaction to this apparent linear flow that you're speaking of? That certain things happen and then you react in a certain way. To what end, I'm asking you? When you do this, then are you going to say that it stops these conditions? All right, repeated reactions such as you described, compared to the circumstances you described, this repeated reaction over and over, is it lessening its effect? Is it lessening the cause's effect? And blue circuit would have to say. Of course, blue circuit would never feel intellectually guilty. They could get annoyed being questioned. But by the time it did that, the yellow circuit would be beginning to get sort of intellectually annoyed at, you dunderhead. You keep saying that 2 and 2 you want to equal 4, and you keep putting 2 and 2 together in such a way it equals 5. And I've asked you 2 or 3 different ways, and you don't see it. That would be, in a sense, thinking what you feel. And the converse of that, if there were a converse, and this was the great church of the tennis shoe, the converse would be remembering, to turn it around the other way, would be remembering that apparently what you think is partially based upon feelings to begin with. So in a sense, you would have an attack on a two-sided coin, that you could turn it in either direction. See if you find any connection to this. I'll dress it back up. I'll bring it up to date. I'll regress it. There's a way in which you could see life using religious approaches to continually alter man's biochemical condition. You can look at it as being what I keep describing as the continual expansion and growth. But you can see in a way that is profitable to you, not through some historical study, but that life has continually, right up until today, used what amounts to 3 religious approaches flowing through the life of man to directly and specifically alter a person, a group of people, a community, a race, a religion, but a community somewhere on this body of life to alter their biochemical condition, to make it change. You could look at it in one way as life moving on the red areas to make man behave better. The red circuit areas, to be more civil, but to behave better. And you could see life moving, and this is not in a linear context. I can make a crude historical mapping and say that this has happened, but it's still happening. Because you got to remember what appears to be linear history is also going like this. That there are people still right here on this planet. There are people in the city limits of where we are right now that in a sense are toiling in the same area of life that everybody in general was 5,000 years ago. That's the way it must be. They're not behind. It just still is work needs to be done, but there are less people required to do it, and conversely, there were people required then to start building other stories for life to grow in a different manner. Comma. So you can see, in the second instance, you can see life moving into the blue circuit areas so as to make man feel better. And I do not, of course, mean physically, but feel better, to be less involved with self-condemnation. Ours is a prime time. The birth, the expansion of modern psychology, psychiatry, even beyond those academic limits now, everything from the latest singles bars amounting to health clubs, alcoholism, finally being, to a large extent, accepted as being a hereditary disease, not a weakness. Drug addiction, quickly catching up with it. So-called mental illness no longer being something to be ashamed of. It is more a tolerance. It's certainly not across the board. It never will be. But there is, when life moves in a certain way, and it does it religiously, it does it in specific areas I could point out, and I'm not going to because you can see them. It does it in areas that are not labeled religious in life, such as, I was hinting, the health craze, people attempting to look better, eat better, feel better, drink less alcohol when they do drink alcohol. But life moves through man in a particular way that amounts to religious. Into the blue circuit area primarily, in certain people, in certain groups of people, in certain areas, space equaling time, if we're not going to do it linearly, but it would apparently then happen just in certain areas that the group seems to be moved upon by something. They can blame it on a prophet, they can blame it on the other people can, the eccentricities of that particular race, that group of people, but it moves in such a way that it amounts to almost a blue circuit religion to make people feel better. And then lastly, if not otherwise, would be you can see in a way life moving. Again, in what amounts to a religious way, even though you might find it in the halls of academia in some cases, but it amounts to moving on the yellow circuit in such a way as to make man think better, to think more efficiently. And the people involved with this, by and large, are a prime example of this. I pointed out, not in the last 8 or 10 months, I guess, but almost all the women who have become involved with this see this without any effort whatsoever. That you personally, and then beyond you personally, what you could feel at the time you grew up, what you can still feel, even though it's undergoing a across-the-board change, that women have never been moved by the need to pursue, to accept energy, to transform it, and then to transmit it on a yellow circuit level to any great degree. That you never really had much interest in it. That's just one example. The parts of the world that are now apparently the most evolved, the most civilized. I'm taking the horizontal manifestations of it, of course, but the IQ continues to improve. That now you have kids that can do things with computers that their fathers, who may have a master's or a PhD, comes in his room and looks at it and fools around with it an hour one night, and he and his partner decide that, you know, this stuff ain't what it's cracked up to be. Or when we buy a bigger one, I'll get involved. That's nothing but a toy. What it amounts to is, you know, he is not wired up. He does not have the need. The higher parts of the yellow circuit may drag him into his son's room after he buys him one for Christmas, and he keeps reading. The computers are the wave of the future. Anybody who is computer illiterate is illiterate, period. And so he goes in and fools with it until such time that unknowingly he realizes, I am not wired up. It is not my job. I am not that interested. It's too confusing. I just don't have the interest. He may curse it, whether we get a bigger one. Whatever the reason, he is not moved to think better in that particular way. But every generation, you should see by now, that indeed life is not going downhill by any means, red, blue, or otherwise, but particularly in the yellow circuit. Artificial hearts. Rockets now getting to the limits of our solar system. Now them playing with the antibodies in one's body. We'll wait and see what life does. I assume some of you heard last night. They announced that they have found something that's just astounding compared to what they had done with the attacks on various forms of cancer in the body. And once you hear about it, it sounds pretty simple, but they're up to things as you all, if you can drag yourself away from line level D-dancing, that although you're going to die, sad to say, although you're going to get old, that many of you are going to get 40-year-old middle crazy. Beyond all of that, things are just moving in a splendid fashion, and particularly life moving in a religious way in the yellow circuit, and people are thinking more and more efficiently. I'm going to leave that part with you, but there is a real way that you can see that life has three general religions, whether they're known as religions or not. And they move in ways that coincidentally fit into my particular mapping of this organism that we call, man. I guess everyone has an obvious voice somewhere that could see that it's quite possible that red circuit equals, if they could be isolated behavior, and blue circuit feeling, and the yellow circuit thinking. And all of them are continually being prodded by life. That life is opening up the channels through everybody. Certain groups of people, it continues that the primary moving of its religion is on their red circuit. Some groups is primarily still on their blue, some is primarily on their yellow. Of course, none of it is in isolation in that way, but you can see it. You can see it enough to realize that this group here, whether it be a community or a nation, a religion, any group you can identify, that this group is involved, life is running a religion through them, and is continually, primarily feeding behavior. It's still trying to make them behave better. And here's a group that's trying to make them feel better. And this group is trying to make them think better, more efficiently. How are we doing on time? 10 minutes. I started to say I guess I should read more of the questions and comments to get them on the videotapes. But after saying that, I'll completely ignore it and press on. Let me try to point your direction to another piece of the master stroke. I'm going to use the terms a greater program and a lesser program. There is a greater program that would amount to a greater program, the apparent out there, the life of life itself, the not I in the equation. And then the lesser program would be that which would be individual, apparently, that which would apparently be internal and private to you. Now, a piece of the master stroke, another partial confrontation with the master stroke is that the greater program has got to be, to put it as an understatement, much, much more complex than the lesser programs, because it has got to contain each and every lesser program that's been wired up. That sounds simple enough, do it not? Everyone did hear that. Just take what I'm saying, that there is what appears to be outside of you, that there is this greater program, and then you've got this lesser program. But the one out here, you got to understand, before I press on, is so complex that it contains every program that's not you, plus yours, except here's the way it operates. Is a part of life's master stroke that I was getting to, is that people have this sensation, again, of there being a kind of free will involved with this, although it will not stand up to any analyzation, but on this basis. As a person sees conditions, and they recognize, and they see another person react to the conditions in a way that they're not wired up to react in that similar manner. And the conclusion that's wired into everyone is there again is a place in which I can move, that there is a reality of freedom, because under those same conditions, I would never react like that. I would choose to react another way, without being able to recognize that the greater program contains everybody's program. Or if you want to get real sharp, I could ask you, based upon my descriptions, of me saying everyone, let's say, has a unique lesser program. We'll say it's unique, whether it is or not. That everybody on this planet was wired up, the circuits are arranged in such a way, they talk to each other in a certain way. You're general and radical in varying hormonal balance, the way in which the neural paths fire up, let's say, renders you unique. If we take that everybody on this planet then has their own lesser program, does anyone see the possibility that the greater program might not be any more than that. But what ordinary consciousness cannot conceive of, not only may it not be no more than that, ordinary consciousness cannot conceive that it may be that. Because if you could be aware of that, then there'd be no question about right behavior, wrong behavior. There'd be none of this fuzzy sensation through which everyone lives, that, wait a minute, there is freedom of will, there's no doubt. It didn't require my church to tell me that. I mean, as soon as I heard it, I knew it was true. We are responsible. And part of the proof is there are conditions. Remember the old movie I drug out a year ago that a priest, however it went, I'll make it up again, Pat O'Brien, James Cagney, whoever it was, a priest is talking to a cop, and the cop is saying, well, oh, so-and-so, I remember when we used to play stickball out here on Bishop Street, but the environment in which poor old so-and-so grew up, I mean, here he is now sitting on death row, but that kind of environment, that kind of poverty, all of his friends began with petty crime, went on to worse things. And the priest says, yeah, but how about his brother? His brother is now studying for the priesthood and was the same conditions. It comes out continually, not just in literature and the movies, and it just stops the scene. That's the end of it, because nobody can go anywhere with that. But part of the unspoken message, if they don't make it any more specific, is the scene just stops there. It's one of the people looks knowingly, maybe one looks disconcerted, like, well, the unspoken part is, all right, there are conditions, says Pat O'Brien, the priest, says one of the voices in life, says one of the temporary spokesmen for one of the forces, that I agree that there would apparently be less than optimum, less than comforting circumstances under which some people, to wit, in this case, so-and-so grew up. But look, his brother grew up a year younger than him, the same conditions, and he's in the priesthood. Someone's lesser program at line level consciousness is continually making this unanalyzed, truly unstated assumption. At line level, we are all wired up to feel as though, under certain conditions, there are different reactions that are possible. Possible to me, possible to everyone else. I know they're possible to everyone else because there are conditions in which I have found myself before. I recognize them, and this person did something I would never have done. I agree the circumstances may have been pressing and less than comfortable, but what that person did, look at the unprofitable result of what they did. I would not have done it. I'm not saying I'm that much of a better person, but I would not have done that under those same circumstances. And all they're seeing is that everyone has a lesser program, and all the lesser programs are contained within the greater program. And by seeing that, they see absolutely nothing. And of course, they do not see another piece of the master stroke of life itself. It continues to make things grow. It continues to produce fertilizer, continues to produce heat, continues to produce criticism, continues to produce in ordinary people the feeling I can press on, something's got to be done. Situations like this, why can't we get these people when they're younger? Why can't these people be more like me under these conditions? Because I would not do that. I know I wouldn't. Let's assume they're telling the truth. But what they don't realize is under those conditions, what I'm saying I would do, that's what I would do, no more, no less. Not because I chose to, that is my lesser program. And also what could not be allowed is to begin to see that there is a greater program. And within the greater program is every lesser program. And to say, well, there is an unnatural program, there is an unnatural reaction, there is a despicable action, there is an unprofitable action, we should in some way pluck this out of life, stamp this out. It's necessary that people apparently feel and speak that way. But in the instantaneousness of your own life, there is no unnatural lesser program. We're back to my, isn't it great to be able to refer to yourself? You remember the preacher I said I heard on the radio talking about an idea he had about loved ones being united with their children that died young, and perhaps they grew up at the same rate of speed up in heaven or paradise, so that when you died, you know, they'd be old enough you could talk to them, but they wouldn't still be a 2-year-old baby. And that if God hadn't thought of this yet, he was going to tell him when he met God. In all sincerity, he said it. And in all sincerity, I ask you, what kind of games is life playing? What kind of proper use is life making of man for people to be wired up to believe that? That I have had a thought that out there has never had. I have done something on my own with this lesser program, that is moi, that non-moi is going to be astounded, will be stupefied. They'll all ask me, yes? Would you repeat that? I can't believe it. Or on the contrary, that is the most despicable thing of which I have ever heard. But in some way, it is going to be in the true, original, old-time meaning of the word unique. It will be truly unique because it will have come from me and nowhere else. Speaking of movies, which always seems to take a load off some people because it's not like starting off and you feel like you're back at home or back in church or in some religious meeting where somebody's going to talk about people and look you dead in the eye. A movie. The two top cops are talking, and one of them, the first cop, is talking about a suspect that they just got. Do you remember old so-and-so? The second cop says, yeah. He said, look, the reason I came to tell you we got him, we've been trying to question him, getting nothing. But he is a prime suspect. You arrested him 2 times previously and sent him away. First cop says, yeah. He says, I believe right now, if we would just take you down the hall into the interrogation room, if you just walked in the door, I believe simply the sight of you, having put him away twice before, might produce just a psychological shock and make him talk. Now, Life had somebody actually write that scene. I didn't make that one up. It doesn't matter. What do people believe they're saying? Since Life will not tell them. What do people believe they're saying about, I assume everyone heard it. In the rest of the movie, I don't even remember what it was. But very likely, surely all of you, you've seen more movies or as many as I have, that very likely they agreed to do it. And they walked down the hall, they stopped and got a cup of coffee and talked to me, and then opened the door, and the first cop walked in, and there sits the suspect, this old hardened con, looking hardened, looking conned. And the first cop walks in, he says, hey, Billy boy. And the guy looks up, and you see the camera, and he does his best to act and wiggle his eyebrows. And you see, in some way, the flash of recognition and things happening, and you see almost this hard persona begin to crack, and you know that the first cop was correct, that the mere sight, the presence of this guy, did produce an absolute psychological shock, and the guy, the facade is gone. He's about to talk. Can anyone see that what Life is talking about without telling people? It's not a matter of a psychological shock. Can you see a potential, literal, biochemical reaction in this case when the suspect is confronted by somebody, and what he takes to be somebody that at one time or 2 times arrested him, and he begins to have biochemical changes as he remembers. Of course, I am not going to name everything, would be here forever. But the parts that he's wired up to remember. The cop walks in the door and he looks at him. Now he begins to remember how he was tracked down. He remembers both times when suddenly this particular cop got him and said, "Brother boy, you're under arrest, you bastard." And he has flashes of the trials, the plea bargaining, or the jury coming back, the way in which they looked at him, the way in which the judge looked at him, the kinds of feelings that he thought the judge was feeling toward him, like, you despicable little piece of nothing. Then the years he spent in jail, 2 or 3 hard times that he had, or being cut, being put in solitary. This whole thing that's happening like this, as all of you should know by now. And it does. It can produce not a psychological shock, not in the sense that there is some special head theorems going on, that there is some special something in life that floats around operating on at this level, but that this whole thing creates a mechanical, biochemical shock in the man's memory, and sure enough, he will. So all right, I'll tell you, I did do it. I confess, I did it. Get that guy out of here. Get him away from me. I did it. But people believe they're talking about something to say a psychological shock when they're apparently, the manifestations of it are real. But after all the examples I keep conjuring up and stealing from movies and TV shows, you're supposed to, on your own by now, begin to get a feeling of that which is almost impossible to remember, that everything that's going on is dependent upon, is absolutely based upon what you can find in yourself as being alterations in your own chemical balance. And to continue, which obviously life is not going to do, or it wouldn't have hired me to be out here talking. But if you're going to continue in your lifetime, that there is a separate aspect of man, the organism, that is psychological, because I see these things happen. I've heard of psychological shocks. I've been involved with them. I've seen them happen to other people. I guess they've happened to me. I just have a crude awareness of it. As though this were something unique in man's organism that was separate in some way from the flow of his blood, the smell of his bowel, and the movements of other unsavory parts. How about this? I'll make you up a scenario. How about 2 people are sitting around, relaxed conditions, and they're listening to a musical performer. And if we were looking in from the outside, apparently both of them seem to be enjoying it. One of them says, "Here's a record I've got that we never had before of such and such artist," and they both seem to like him. They pour themselves a beer and they put it on, the guy's singing and the band's going. And man 1 just read this morning that this artist died last night. And man 2 doesn't know it. Even man 1's aware that he does know it, because he would surely mention it by now. Since they were talking about, oh, a brand new record, yeah, I still like him. Well, where'd you get it? I'm going to be sure and get it too. Let's hear it. And they put it on, they're listening. One man knows that this guy died 12 hours ago, the guy that they're listening to, and the other guy doesn't know it. Can any of you ask yourselves questions, non-verbally, pursuing neuralizing and taking it outdoors, being able to see that which you should not see? To be able to ask yourself such nonverbal questions as, if the second person were suddenly told, they're sitting there and they're sipping their beer, listening and smiling, patting their foot, and man 1 says to man 2, "Oh, I read he died last night, just, they said, in his sleep." Can any of you, that's unfair, all of you, that's cheap, all of you should be able to feel, now that I pointed out, that were you man 2, that something that fast, something that you were wired up, that you had some interest, that you were sincerely listening to the latest record that man 1 had by this guy, and you're listening along, already made plans to write down the name and get it. Maybe it made some comments about, you know, that guy can still, if I could sing like him, I'd forget fame and fortune if I could just sing like that. And so the man, too, right in the middle of one of the cuts says, oh, I forgot to tell you, he died last night. The feeling of relationship, you should know by now, changes. But what has happened? Ordinary people say, well, you know, it's human to feel if you really like somebody, if you didn't know them, you heard that your favorite singer had died just unexpectedly. It's quite human to maybe feel momentarily depressed or perhaps taken aback, if people feel taken aback anymore, but used to people seem to have felt taken aback. All these great human emotions, all these things that apparently are being carried through the airways, that there you sit, there sits man number 2 listening to so-and-so sing, thinking, boy, God, I got to get that album. I wish I had every album he'd ever made. And another voice, another larynx, squeezes air. Somewhere up in here it forms sounds, and it says, oh, he died last night, and it floats through the air, these sound waves. It gets in here, and a biochemical alteration takes place. Now, it seems real enough to say, all right, you're slightly depressed, momentarily taken aback to hear that he died. Well, what kind of knowledge is that to say, well, it's only human to feel bad? The feeling of relationship was already in someone's memory. They didn't have to, you've never met this guy. There has been a biochemical alteration by apparently hearing sound waves, by apparently hearing knowledge that he died. I didn't know him, never saw him, never been in the same state with him as far as I know, never seen a picture of him. And now another human tells me, I don't know whether it's true, but if it's a friend of yours sitting there, there's no reason he'd lie, he says, he died. And just like that, your feeling about what was going on has been altered. And if an ordinary person were asked to explain this or try to hold their attention even for 2 or 3 minutes after taking to talk about it, to them it's just obvious. What are you wasting time about? Something like that. If somebody liked him and now they find out he's dead, he can't make any more records, or maybe the person thought, well, hey, he's not much older than me, I read. And so then they begin to have to be confronted with their own impending mortality and all that. There has been an absolute, instantaneous, no matter how slight, biochemical change in the condition of the person who heard about the death of the performer on the record. Can any of you see? I'm not just talking about records and famous people. That there is a biochemical alteration going on to learn of the death of anyone, even to learn of illness. For you to meet somebody that you have known and you renew old times for a few seconds, and you say, oh, you married old Betty so-and-so, did you? He says, yeah. And you say, I used to really like her. How's she doing? The guy said, well, she's dying of cancer. You hadn't seen her in 20 years. You hadn't even thought about her in 20 years until you met her husband. And after a few seconds, a few minutes, you were laughing, slapping each other. Where you live now? Did you finally finish school and become an architect? You married Betty, didn't you? Yeah, and all this, ha, ha, ha. And you say, how's she doing? And he says, she's dying. What seems to be, in one instance, a continuing kind of conventional conversation between people, the relaying that so-and-so is ill, the relaying that so-and-so has died, people that you did not know personally, is a biochemical alteration, and it can operate in two ways I would try and direct your attention that you can take it on your own. Is the alteration into your memory of somebody, or, in the real sense of the word, your imagination of them. That is, somebody you did not know, but you apparently had a feeling of relationship toward a recording artist, toward a writer, some author that you had read his books or her books. And suddenly you were reading the paper. You just picked up their new book. You were reading it last night, and you get this morning, and there back on page 12, it says, last night she died. She was hit by a car. And you seem to have undergone something. Rather than taking all this as being the ordinary flows of human emotion, that's the way things are, and that's the way people are, what ordinary consciousness has yet to be able to conceive of in life is we're talking about literal, physical alterations in the biochemical program of individual lesser programs. And its purpose is to keep energy flowing. To keep energy flowing in ways that from one viewpoint you could ridicule, you could attack, you could laugh and say, why in the world is somebody getting upset because they heard that Blind Willie Ledbetter, some old blues singer, died last night? Here's a guy, he's got a PhD in economics, he's driving a Porsche, and he's sitting around listening to this guy's old records, and somebody says, he died. And how silly, the guy suddenly set down his beer and got and walked out of the room. I saw him, he walked out and he walked down the porch and kind of looked around. This guy's an idiot. Or to hear that somebody is ill, somebody that you hadn't seen in 20 years. I hadn't even thought about them. But suddenly, just sort of by accident, you hear that they're dying of cancer. Or to hear about somebody that you didn't like, some distant relative that you had an argument with 10 years ago, and you hear that they're dying. What consciousness cannot conceive of is all this is serving a purpose. There is nothing foolish, there is nothing wasted going on. It's not a matter that there are weak people in the world. It's not a matter that there are people who are too emotional or people who are less than adequately emotional. It's not a matter that there are people going through life that do nothing but convey bad news, although that seems to be true. It's not a point that, well, shame on them, something should be done with that. It's not a matter that memory is a boon to mankind, because without memory, we couldn't build anything. Every time somebody built a light bulb, they'd turn away to go to the bathroom and come back, and the whole world had forgotten how to do light bulbs, and we'd have to go through the whole process of inventing the light bulb or the internal combustion engine. But then from that, people can attack memory. They can see it as being a personal Pandora's box of all these psychological traumas that one has suffered, that someone has in some way got to undo the past. From another viewpoint, you could say the past is absolutely useless and people shouldn't dwell on it. Somewhere in between all that, of course, I pointed out that for a few people, some of it is more efficient to be pursued than others. But speaking about life in general, what consciousness cannot conceive of is that there are continual biochemical alterations taking place. You petting the dog's reaction to it. You petting your girlfriend or boyfriend, you sticking your tongue out at somebody. You're remembering somebody in a harsh manner. You're remembering somebody in less than a harsh manner when you hear words that say they think that he may have lung cancer and may die. Oh. But people take this as being some kind of emotional, personal occurrence taking place that someone chose. Or they take it as being some kind of intellectual process taking place. Them analyzing how the person treated me, and will I feel sorry that they're dying? Will I think so-and-so, will I go to the funeral? Should I send flowers? How much should I spend? Should a person even be expected to do this when they've been mistreated in the way that I was by so-and-so? They do not see a living organism that food, energy, heat is being transferred from one person to another. It is done by words. It is done apparently internally in another person through so-called memory. That is a recycling of energy. And to say that it is foolish for someone to apparently react to the death of someone they don't know, for someone to apparently change their memory. You remember your old third cousin Fred? Well, we got a Fred here, so I can't keep using that example. Your old Bartholomew, Yeah, I remember it. I remember old Bart. That son of a bitch still owes me $40. You're having a memory, apparently. You're engaged in something that is unique, something that is inexplicably human, the psychology of man. Yeah, I remember old Bart, that bastard owed me $20. You didn't hear he got hit by a train? Oh, no. Oh, geez. We're talking about biochemical changes going on continuously like this. Me making jokes, me stopping and looking down, me looking off, and some of you looking off. Too many of you look off, and I look off. But also notice, even since last week, my opening comments last week were pointing out the near impossibility. At anything resembling the ordinary level of consciousness, for one to remember that everything one feels, everything one thinks, every way in which one behaves is a biochemical reaction, and the near impossibility to remember that the thing apparently thinking, feeling, and moving and behaving is likewise an absolute biochemical process. Moi? No, no, no. I am far too unique, far too splendid, far too terrible for that to be true. I am in some way responsible for this state of affairs. And verily, verily, saith Larry, that's the way it must be. But then how do you explain that Larry sent me here to tell you otherwise? Did anyone, over my general suggestion, you recall, of coming up with, if you did, some new approach to the Machiavellian missiles having to do with the ruling of kingdoms, did anyone along the way, tell me you did, suspect, of course, that I was pointing out about an internal kingdom? I glanced at several of the things that some of you handed in, and some of you, of course, did stumble across that. But how about this? Did anybody, did it cross your little, at least yellow circuit thresholds, any connection, perhaps, between the idea of the dictates on operating a kingdom and my rhetorical question to you about, is everything negotiable? And then would it be possible to negotiate with the partner? Can anyone take my questions about possible negotiation and the idea of the prince in some way go,